All right, welcome back. In case you're just joining us, it's time for our conversation right now. My guests are with me here in the studio. The World Bank Country Director, Shubham Chaudhuri, is to my immediate right. Shubham, good to have you on the program again. Welcome.
Nancy,
Good
thank you
morning.
for having us.
Marco Hernandez is also to my right, but to my far right. Marco, good to see you. He's the lead economist at World Bank Nigeria. Welcome again to the program.
Good morning, and good morning to all Nigeria.
Let me start by asking how. Let's start on this with this background. The last time, of course, you were on my show here, there was no COVID-19. You know, we talked about that was just last year, I think. We talked about what Nigeria needed to do to come back strong. We had a lot of macroeconomic issues and all of that. How has it been really, even working with the pandemic? Because I think I interviewed you. I interviewed both of you. I think that was in April.
That's right.
You know, so how has it been?
So I think what the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on Nigeria is similar in many ways to what it has been and for other countries, but with one big difference, which is Nigeria was already facing lots of things that it needed to address in order for the smooth recovery from the previous recession, and the kind of the buffers, as we say, in terms of the space that government has, that the private sector has to respond. It's a bit like how healthy are you before, when you know that there's going to be before you fall ill. And so Nigeria was not quite back to full health when the pandemic hit. The second thing is that Nigeria, even if Nigeria survives, contains the outbreak in terms of COVID-19, which I hope Nigeria will, the fact that oil prices have fallen as much as they have and that they're likely to stay low is what makes the challenge even more for Nigeria than for many other countries.
Marco, how sick is Nigeria?
Well, let me start by basically trying to highlight the main factors that need to be considered when we are trying to see how Nigeria is faring in the middle of the shock. And the first thing is what we call the channels of transmission, right? So if we're sick, are we touching something that is going to get us sicker? Are we going to a place where, there are sicker people, etc.? So if we're looking at this channel, the first one is definitely the oil price. Shubham already highlighted there was a big fall, and the oil price is incredibly important for Nigeria's economies. It's more than 80% of exports. It's more than half of the government revenues, so the general government revenues. It's more than 1/3 of the banking sector credit. And it's very important because the foreign currency that the oil sector brings is very important for the non-oil sector. So that's one channel. The second channel is remittances. And this is an important one because in the previous crisis, for example, the one from 2015 and 16, remittances globally did not really fall. And now we're seeing a drop in global remittances, and global remittances are very important for Nigeria. They're more than 5% of GDP, so basically they're higher than the amounts of all foreign direct investment in the country and all development assistance combined, right? So what happens there, very important. The third channel is capital flows. So, the pandemic has increased risks worldwide, and investors are very worried, and they have been taking their money away from developing economies like Nigeria, and they're putting it in safer places. And we have seen already that even before COVID-19, foreign portfolio inflows were declining a bit, and now they have declined much more. So that's a third source of a channel. And the fourth is the lockdown itself, because it is very necessary to contain the spread of the virus, but it also has unintended consequences. It affects supply chains and sectors that otherwise wouldn't have been as affected by COVID-19. For example, agriculture, because of the lockdown, they're now being affected. Farmers cannot get workers for their farms, and also they're finding it particularly difficult to get their products out to the market. So these four channels are, even as Shubham was already highlighting, even if Nigeria manages to contain the outbreak, and we very much hope that it will, all of these other channels will still be affecting the economy.
Now, taking a look at this report, I hope my camera people can take that so that viewers at home can see it well. The report is titled Nigeria in Times of COVID-19, Laying Foundations for a Strong Recovery, Nigeria Development Updates, June 2020. This report is to be called Nigeria Economic Updates. So why was it renamed? I'm curious.
Marco, you want to take that?
Yes. Well, I think that because we are covering more and more issues that have to do way beyond just how Nigeria's economy is faring, like, for example, what happens to poverty, what happens to the labor market, what happens to agriculture, all of these are critical for the development path of Nigeria. So we thought we would spread the scope of this work, and since it has been getting more attention, then we're trying to cover also more topics.
Okay, okay. So that explains it. What is in this report? Where should we start from? Because quite a whole lot. In fact, what made headlines when this report came out just a few days ago is that Nigeria is to face the worst economic recession in 40 years. That's not going down well with a lot of us. Shubham?
So I think what we are saying is that Nigeria should be prepared because of the scale of the global crisis. In some sense, what happened in 2015, 2016, Nigeria was hit hard, but other economies around the world were not hit as hard, especially the ones that are not so dependent on oil revenues. This time around, it's the entire world. So even as oil prices, that's what's likely to keep oil prices low for longer. And when that happens, because of Nigeria's kind of vulnerability to oil price shocks, what could happen in Nigeria is much more severe than what we were talking about in 2015, 2016. And really we had to go back all the way to the situation that Nigeria faced at the time of the first deep oil price shock in the 80s. Now, what we have to be careful here that we're saying that, look, Nigeria has to be prepared for it, but there's an element of, what Nigeria does to respond. Just like if a household is hit with a shock, how the family responds, really determines how bad the shock is. So right now we're saying, look, the economy is going to contract, but exactly how much it contracts is really, there is an element of this which is up to both government in terms of the policies and programs, but also private individuals, communities everywhere. So that's the bottom line message, that this is unprecedented. This is something that Nigeria has not seen in at least 4 decades. But there is scope for a response, and we talk about, look, what are the likely channels, as Marco explained? What are the kinds of things that can help mitigate the impact, the adverse impacts? And then we talk about specific policy suggestions.
Okay, let's go straight to that, because it's not really good news in terms of this is what Nigeria is facing, the worst economic recession in 40 years since the 80s. That will definitely have severe consequences on Nigerians, on lives, and also on livelihoods. What are the things that would not make us face that?
So Nancy, before going into the things, let me lay out a few numbers that we highlight in the report, which I think are important to provide that context, right? And this is what Shubham was highlighting, those impacts, right? So the contraction of the economy. If we assume that COVID-19 will be contained in Nigeria by the third quarter of 2020, and there is a speedy policy response, and the authorities are already taking measures in that regard, assuming those things, and also assuming that the world economy will start to recover towards the second half of 2020, we're seeing a contraction in the economy of about 3% this year, right? It will recover to about 1.7% in 2021. Now that depends on many factors. It's a very uncertain scenario. It could be also as bad as -7%, -8% negative growth this year alone, right? And what could happen for if Nigeria were being in this scenario, it would be maybe a slower pace of reforms, but it would also depend a lot on what happens with the oil prices. It will depend a lot on what happens with the containment of COVID-19 in Nigeria, right? So that, for example, is one range of possibilities that we are considering. Now, what would the economy then translate into in terms of jobs, in terms of poverty? And what we saw, for example, in the last recession in 2016, is that it pushed a lot of people to unemployment. So we saw that, for example, there were the periods of 5 years just before and then continued after the previous recession up to 2018. There were about 19 million Nigerians that wanted to enter the labor market, seeking for employment. But out of this 19 million, only 4 million of them were able to find jobs. Right? So those that have been unemployed have remained unemployed since then, and if we have another shock, that's something to consider the impact on the labor market. And the third part that I want to highlight is the impact on poverty. Because growth has been below the rate of population growth in Nigeria, that means that per capita incomes, right, which is basically just the division between income and the total population, has been falling. It has been falling since 2016. So that means that poverty was already increasing because incomes were lower. So before COVID-19, we were projecting that in 2020, we were going to have an additional 2 million Nigerians falling into poverty because incomes were falling. So this was before the pandemic. As a result of the pandemic, we're expecting a significant increase now of an additional 5 million Nigerians falling into poverty. So 5 plus 2, 7 in total. And that's a huge number, as Shubham was highlighting already, a completely unprecedented crisis.
The areas, what are the main areas of vulnerabilities, especially for us right now in this pandemic? Where are we going to be hit the most? Apart from the oil price collapse, you know, where are Nigerians going to really feel the pinch? You know, where are those vulnerabilities coming in from?
So I think first, the oil price pinch is going to translate into a huge shock for government's finances. So if you think about everything that the government does in terms of keeping, paying for primary health care, paying for basic education, there's going to be fewer funds, or building roads. So there are going to be fewer funds available because the government is facing somewhere close to between the federal government and the subnational, the states, between $15 to $20 billion shortfall because revenues have dropped. So that's one. Now, how does that translate into kind of the pinch for ordinary households? I think many people have already started to feel this, right? Loss of jobs, or for those who rely on the informal economy. I mean, I can't imagine what it must be like to, for a family that relies on going out and, trying to sell things or hustling on the streets. All of a sudden, they can no longer put food on the table at the end of the day. And they're having to do this on a daily basis. So I think the pinch that's where, something as abstract, you think about oil prices, what economists focus on, how that translates into kind of real hardship for ordinary families who are struggling to put food on the table. Or in this case, the other thing, that area where people are going to face the pinch is if family members, especially elderly family members, fall sick, being able to find the right care. So that's why there is this sense of urgency, this kind of awareness that this is an unprecedented shock. But I don't want it to be all doom and gloom. I mean, what we are also stressing is that this is also an occasion to rise to the challenge. There are things that government can do. There are things that private entrepreneurs can do. Often crises provide the best opportunities for moving into new markets, to grow, to let the creative instinct come forth. So, but there is a sense of urgency, and a recognition of the scale of the shock. We have focused on the first point, that for government to respond on a scale that's needed, the first thing is the government has to have the fiscal resources. So that's why it's all about, imagine if someone in your household, in your family lost their job, what does the entire family do? Okay, how do we get together and make sure that we have enough resources to keep our kids in school, okay, to put enough food on the table? So those are the kinds of choices that government needs to make.
Are you seeing that sense of urgency already? Because I know, even when I interviewed both of you, I think in April, you were having constant meetings with the president and perhaps the vice president. Are you seeing that sense of urgency?
Very much so, certainly at the highest levels, but it needs to be something that percolates down through all levels of government, but more importantly, between government, private firms, and communities. And when I say all levels of government, it's both all tiers within the federal government, but also at the state level and all tiers of the state level, because this is one of those situations where it's an all hands on deck, right? So you need everyone to come together and feel that sense of urgency, because it is a twin crisis. You have to respond in terms of containing the outbreak, but you also have to respond in terms of preparing for the economic shocks.
Marco, are we seeing enough of that sense of urgency from our subnationals?
So I think there has definitely been movement, and in the report we highlight 5 critical directions or policy areas that need to be considered. And I think the government, as both federal, subnational, local governments, are already taking action in this. What we are stressing is the importance to keep the pace, right? Because even our best efforts are not sometimes not going to be enough, right? This is an unprecedented crisis, so we need to keep pushing to make sure that we can do our best and of course mitigate all of the potential costs that the pandemic could bring. So the first area is about containing the outbreak, as Shubham already highlighted. Containing the outbreak and preparing for a more severe outbreak. That's critical, right? The public health response is essential. Things that the federal government can do, the state level, things that the private sector could do, things that we can do as individual citizens as well to keep others safe, right? The second area is about the macroeconomic management. So critical to ensure strengthen macroeconomic management so that there are more investors that are willing to put their money to support that recovery. The third area is about revenues, as Shubham already highlighted. They have been hugely shocked due to COVID-19. So safeguarding revenues and financing flows is critical throughout all the levels of government. The fourth area is about expenditure. So the government right now does not have a lot of fiscal space, as we highlighted before, but it needs to make the most of the resources that it currently has. So how to reprioritize, how to redirect, how to make sure that there are actions that are taken so that some things that maybe are taking away money from the fiscal accounts, are reformed so that that doesn't happen in the future, right? Things that maybe were not on budget, let's bring them on budget so they're also more transparent. So I think those are critical actions to take. And the fifth one, it's really about supporting lives and livelihoods. COVID-19, it's going to be particularly tragic because of the loss of life, and we're very much aware of that. But at the same time, it's really about protecting lives and livelihoods for, from the farmers in parts of the country where they're struggling to cope with rain or with other type of natural disasters, to also the informal economy for those that have to hustle every day.
Now let's quickly take a look at those five critical areas, because the way you enumerated it sounds so simple, but I know it's not as simple as it is. The first one, which you talked about, containing the outbreak, we've seen public health narratives, we've seen public health realities. Just the global cases have exceeded 10 million, global deaths over 500,000. And here in Nigeria, we have fragile health systems. Mm-hmm. So how optimistic are you that we're going to even be able to contain the outbreak? Because you did say even in your report that if we're able to contain the outbreak, by the third quarter, we'll still contract, but not as much as. Are you very optimistic? Because for me, I'm not seeing, we're already going into the third quarter. I think tomorrow will be the end of the second quarter. Mm-hmm. So the third quarter will start July 1. How optimistic is the World Bank that Nigeria can contain the COVID-19 outbreak with fragile health systems?
I think Nigeria, I would say we're hopeful, okay? We're hopeful because, look, you have the Presidential Task Force, you have NCDC, you have many of the governors who are very aware of and alive to this issue. You also have Nigeria, like many other sub-Saharan African countries, has a natural advantage because of how young the population is. Okay, one of the things we know globally is that the fatality rates, kind of how hard COVID-19 hits you if you are infected, does depend on these very clearly identifiable risk factors. So Nigeria has some built-in kind of strengths in that regard. What is needed right now is very clear messaging from government, which has begun, but I think just even more in terms of communicating, get the awareness amongst community and traditional leaders through churches, mosques, everywhere, that there are some simple things that can be done. Putting on a face mask, social distancing, and otherwise, life for those, who are young, who are not in these high-risk categories, can proceed with those, it's not going to be back to the old normal. It will be a new normal, but it doesn't have to be a complete lockdown. So to the extent that that message gets through, to the extent that on the public health front, as NCDC has been doing, really going forward on the testing and the tracing and what they call infection prevention and control measures, I think we are hopeful, and we do see right now that action is starting at the state level. So it has a lot of it you hear about from NCDC, which is the Nigeria Center for Disease Control, and the Presidential Task Force. But having that, so the plans are there, now comes the actual implementation to be really robust and with that sense of urgency. So we're hopeful, we do see movements, but the states will play a critical role here.
Because we're seeing rising and a pickup in the cases. The daily infection rates are rising. Now let's take a look at that second critical area which you talked about that would move our recovery. You enumerated five of them, but I still want to look at it critically. You talked about the macroeconomic management, enhancing macroeconomic management to boost investors' confidence. You also talked about there may just be a decrease of even remittances this year because this crisis is global. So not everyone would have so much money to even send to their loved ones at home because people are trying to keep afloat. Right. And if you take a look at Nigeria's macroeconomic numbers, they weren't really looking so pretty because we're just trying to come out of a recession. It was a fragile growth of about 2%. There's no much fiscal space. Inflation is picking up. The numbers are not too good. So how can these macroeconomic numbers, because investors will really look at these macroeconomic numbers and oil price isn't helping us at all.
So putting oil aside, I think we have established that is a critical, important variable, but let's look at a few others, right? So growth is one. And what was driving growth? The sectors that were driving growth, some of them are going to be hardly hit and some of them are going to be a bit more restricted. But overall, we see all sectors of the economy are going to be impacted just to different extents, right? So for example, finance was doing pretty well, the same thing as telecommunications. So telecommunications now may be seeing a bit more of an opportunity to expand its market, but finance may also be exposed to the oil sector, right? So that's a counterbalance. Some of the sectors that were growing resiliently throughout the years, including agriculture, construction as well, you know, these are sectors that are also going to be hit by the lockdown conditions and some other disruptions on supply chains. So that those are, you know, how growth and how investment comes into these sectors is critical. So what are the investors looking for? They're looking for predictability, they're looking for action, they're looking for coordination. You know, coordination between the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities, how to make sure that the resources are deployed to the most effective places and whatnot. The other thing is about what can be contained, and one thing that we believe that could be contained, even despite there's a lot of pressures on that regard, is prices. You know, as you said, inflation was picking up, and it had been picking up before COVID-19. You know, one of the reasons why it was picked up, which we highlighted in the report, was due to the border closure in August of last year. And that had increased, so you know, inflation was trending down, the border closure was put in place, and it started to pick up. So by the time that COVID-19 hit, there were additional lockdown restrictions, of course, to contain the virus, but the inflation had already been picked up, right? So we're now reaching potentially 14% of inflation at the end of 2020, right? So that's very high, and it makes it difficult to contain. But there are policies that is set in place, we believe, can definitely mitigate these impacts, and the authorities once again are taking measures in that regard. Both you know, the Central Bank of Nigeria, the Ministry of Finance.
Yes, I was coming to that because that's also what investors may look at in terms of monetary and exchange rate. How does the World Bank feel about this? Because I think even before the last time we had the interview, you did talk to me about the exchange rate. But now it seems that the Central Bank, the Monetary Authority, is trying to unify the exchange rate. Is the bank happy, and how optimistic are you with this?
So I think there are two aspects to exchange rate policy and management, and both have to do with clarity, transparency, and predictability, which is ultimately, you know, private investors, more than anything else, they want to know what, you know, the term sheet is. You know, what are the terms and conditions under which they will have to operate in Nigeria, like in other countries. So they're looking at, you know, do I have a sense of how things will play out? And the more exchange rates there are, then, you know, the clarity about, okay, which one applies for what, you know, probably you can figure it out, but it takes a little bit more work. Same thing with kind of predictability in terms of, okay, if I have dollars that I need to, say, if I'm a domestic firm, I need to service my foreign currency debt. Can I get the dollars? Or if I'm an investor, foreign investor, either a portfolio investor or a foreign direct investor, at the point when I'm trying to repatriate some of my initial investment, can I get dollars? So on both of these, the signals that are sent by the central bank, the kind of the policy about this, how effectively the market windows work are really critical. I've seen the reports from recently, and I think what the governor has said is very promising in terms of his intention to move towards unification, towards having a more flexible policy in terms of exchange convertibility and issues like that. The one other thing I would say is, we noticed that even at the market window, which is the investor and exporters window, the exchange rate has not moved as much. Now, there are multiple reasons for this. Part of this is kind of the demand for imports or other things may have shrunk. But if you look at compared to other countries that I would consider Nigeria as kind of comparators, like India or Indonesia, there's been quite a bit more movement. So then the issue there is we're trying to understand what's keeping the exchange rate kind of fixed. At certain times, having a stability is very useful. But if this stability is coming in the sense of keeping, it's the pressure cooker example that I used here once before. That pressure cookers have valves on top so that you let off the steam every once in a while. So I think it's important to make sure that there isn't a pent-up demand and to release it a little bit so that the overall kind of stability can be maintained.
Let's talk about this prioritizing public spending to protect critical development expenditure. We know that we do not have so much fiscal space right now. The government has come up with a 2.3 trillion fiscal plan to get us out of this. 500 billion naira. That's part of the 2.3 trillion, 1.1 trillion coming from the Monetary Authority and all of that. There's also the issue of debt. The Nigeria approached the World Bank. I would also want you to talk to me about the situation in terms of the loans, because they also approached the IMF, your twin, for some kind of support. So also speak to me about that. How do we prioritize this public spending? Marco, you want to take that?
Sure. Let me take the first part.
Yes,
I'll
then
leave
come back to because I know that's
Shubham. Yes.
That's Shubham's question.
Exactly. So let me start by saying that here we have good news, right? We have good news, and let me break them down. So the first one is that the government has already been taking action. And the amended budget for 2020, it's the best example of this reprioritization, redirection of spending, right? It has taken a while to negotiate and everything, but the underlying points of this budget is that, first of all, it's much more let's say, realistic in terms of the projections for the fiscal deficit. And this is very important because if you know that your revenues are going down, you know that you have to keep expenditures up because you need to stimulate the economy at the same time, it is critical that those projections are as close to reality as possible, because that definitely affects your debt, the amount of debt that you're going to be incurring. And as a result, because the amended budget is now making very transparent how much debt Nigeria will have in 2020, the government is now allowed to go and borrow now instead of borrowing later when the interest rates might be higher, right? So that's one critical aspect. In addition to the fact that it also have a stimulus package to confront the COVID-19 pandemic, more spending on health, more spending on critical containment efforts. That's laudable. Now, there's an additional point that I also want to bring the good news, because and these two good news are stipulated in the budget, right? There are assumptions in the amended budget, is that there were possibilities to reprioritize money, because Nigeria was spending huge amounts of money on things that were not necessarily that effective, and one of them was gasoline subsidies and electricity subsidies. Okay, so these two I want to highlight because there have been some critical announcements, and we want to commend the government for taking those, about making sure that gasoline prices will be market reflective, like rice or something else, right? So prices go up, prices go down, but in previous years, because the price had kept at a constant rate and the imported price was actually much higher, the government was spending close to, for example, in 2019, about $1.8 billion, much higher amount in 2018 and before. And this is money that could have otherwise have been redirected for health, for education, etc. The same thing for electricity subsidies. So in this regard, the announcements of the tariff increase on July 1st, 2 days from now, it's also laudable because it is, especially now when Nigeria needs to do all it can to marshal the needed fiscal resources in order to contain the virus, right? We've gone through the numbers and we know the potential impacts. We need resources, and these are critical places where these resources could come from.
Okay, Shubham, take the other question.
So I always think of a country is no different from a family in some ways. So imagine a family where maybe the main income earner all of a sudden finds that the income that they can bring in has gone down. Okay, so it becomes much harder to put food on the table. It becomes much harder to pay the university bill for the child. So then that family has a choice, right? You can either just go with what the income is and say, okay, no, I'm sorry, tell your daughter you have to, stop
School.
university, stop school. Or you can say, look, let's begin with, if you look at the three things that we say, let's begin with saying, where can we cut back on our other expenditures? Maybe we don't need to, buy as many new clothes this year, right? So that's part of the redirecting, to get a bit more so we can keep our daughter in school, okay? Or you say, look, this is really important. If she drops out of school now, that's going to just affect the rest of her life. So instead, can we see if we can borrow to keep her in school so we can pay the tuition for the coming year till, maybe the father's income rises again, okay? That's the situation that Nigeria is in right now, that the government needs resources to help both on the health front, but also in terms of the fiscal stimulus to help ordinary households, Nigerians, get through this crisis by providing palliatives, providing other kinds of assistance. The question is, so that's why the whole topic of it would be great if Nigeria had the revenues at the moment, it does not. So that is a huge priority. We've talked about this before, but that's not something you can do immediately. Right? So then the question is, does it make sense for Nigeria to borrow at this time of need? We would say it's a qualified yes. Qualified yes, because if it's used for the right purposes. It's like if the family decides to borrow so that their daughter can stay in school, then it makes sense. If the family decides to borrow so that maybe the son gets to go out and have a big party, then you wouldn't want it. So it really comes down to it's the twin package of borrowing, but also ensuring that what you borrow for, what Nigeria borrows for, is spent for the right things. And that's where the role of civil society, the role of the ordinary Nigerians in holding government accountable, saying, okay, if you are borrowing, if the government is borrowing, what is it being spent on?
Now, one of those is the World Bank's approval of $750 million loan to improve reliability of power supply. Shubham, can you speak to me about it also? And is it also part of the power sector recovery plan that
Absolutely.
was done in 2017? I think there was a $2.5 billion which the World Bank approved at that time. I don't know if the conditions are met.
Right.
So speak to me about that.
No, so a couple of facts about the power sector and about access to electricity. So the first thing that every Nigerian may know but ought to know is that nearly 80 million Nigerians, mostly those who live in rural areas or even in kind of urban, poor sections of cities, do not have access to electricity. Okay, so in other words, what's happening with tariffs? They're still having to pay, if they can afford it, pay really high prices to get diesel-generated electricity. Second, even when firms or households have access to the grid, get power from one of these distribution companies, it's not very reliable. And you often get charged for things that, even though you haven't had the supply.
You get charged for darkness.
Yes.
Not low lights.
So you have access to, and third, despite the fact that 40%, and often the poorest Nigerians don't have access to electricity, as Marco mentioned, the government has been, just to keep the lights on for however long they are, has been spending upwards of, I think over the last 4 years, over 2 trillion naira. Okay. So, we tend to come to the World Bank because our focus is on helping our member countries reduce poverty. When we look at government spending, we always ask, how is this benefiting the poor? Okay. And if you look at the 2 trillion that was spent, the question is, did this benefit the poor? So, using the data from the National Bureau of Statistics, we looked at some of the breakdown. Well, the 40% of the poorest certainly didn't benefit them because they don't have a connection. Even amongst the rest, it turns out that the bulk of the spending benefited households and firms that are towards the top of who are better off. Okay? So then the question is, okay, why? That may still be worth doing, and that's a decision ultimately for Nigeria to make. Okay, maybe there are some things that government should be spending money for, even if it just benefits the top end. But it has to, the reason why government's having to spend this is because the tariffs that were set are neither cost reflective, nor are they measured to kind of align with the service. So, and this is basically where the power sector recovery program that you mentioned tries to change that. They say that, look, tariffs should be cost reflective, but the distribution companies should also be held accountable for the service they provide. So customers should not have to pay for power that they're not getting or for unreliable supply. On the other hand, if they do get reliable supply, they should pay what it costs to deliver. Okay? Except for the lowest income households who, just as there's social assistance, this is a form, the lowest poorest households who do have a connection, you can hold the tariffs down for them. So the $750 million program that was approved, though it has not been signed yet, it has been approved by our board, was basically to support the government in this slow process of turning around the power sector, okay, including things like providing regulatory clarity so private investors will want to start investing again in the power sector. There hasn't been any new investment in the power sector. And Nigeria right now, total consumption is about somewhere between 3,500 to 3,000 to 3,500 megawatts. Right? It is on a per capita basis. Energy consumption in Nigeria is lower than most sub-Saharan African countries.
Now, the federal government also has entered into a deal with Siemens to increase the megawatts, I think 7,000, 11,000, and 25,000. That will be in 3 phases. Is the bank also encouraged, the World Bank also encouraged with that? And just before we go, because we have about 2 minutes to end this program, how optimistic are you that we'll get the power sector right? Because even as we battle the pandemic, the beautiful thing is that if we're able to get the power sector right, it can lift a lot more people out of poverty. More small businesses will come up, some that are existing would get that vibe again, they would employ more people, and we will easily get out of the recession. That's my own little analysis of it. But what do you think?
So I think, the Siemens plan, the Presidential Power Initiative, is important because to turn around the power sector, you need 4 things. First, you certainly need the investments in equipment and systems. That's what the Presidential Power Initiative is about. Then you need to make sure that the actors in the electricity industry are operationally efficient. Then you need the right policy and regulation, and then you need the fiscal sustainability.
Okay.
The power sector reform plan does that, all the 4 bits of it.
Okay.
So.
I think I'll end with Marco. One thing that is always fascinating to me is the way you publish this report, and you always put an artwork. Very nice, because I love arts. So speak to me about this art. I really, is it a Nigerian artist?
Yes. Okay. So the artist's name is Lillian, and she painted this in the middle of the lockdown. It basically resembles the resilience of Nigeria, and it's there are 2 women running and trying to support efforts, only armed with a hand sanitizer and, of course, their face masks.
Yeah.
So we wanted to show a positive message, and if people do come together, I think that the situation can improve.
Why women? There's no man in the art. Because, you know, for me, like I said, I love art and I can interpret it. So perhaps deal with us women. Women will give us faster economic recovery, who knows, from the artwork.
You have an honorable Minister of
Finance.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for coming on the
Thanks
show.
to you.
Thank you. All right, I've been speaking with Marco Hernandez, the lead economist for Nigeria, World Bank, as well as the country director, World Bank, Shubham Chaudhuri. We've been talking for the past 45 minutes or so on the report, Nigeria in Times of COVID-19, laying foundations for a strong economic recovery. So many thanks, gentlemen. Hope to see you again soon.